Hey, this is John from Gadeon. Today I just want to make a quick video on how to read better. And basically the reason why I'm making this is as one, a continuation of the primer prior to the series that we create on investment analysis later. And the other part is because I understand that quite a lot of people have difficulty with reading well. And this is an important skill to have. So there are there's a lot of people online who have been, I guess, championing this silly idea that like coding or coding will become the new reading or something like that. And it's unsurprising those people think that coding is also on the way out. So anyways, how do you read better? Well, basically the way that I would answer this question is fundamentally by looking at like what actually makes reading difficult. Now I'm going to mention on the sidebar here, obviously, if you have if you don't have the language ability to read a certain text, then you need to work on that first, right? And so then that means taking a step back from the current text you're reading and reading something that's easier, and then working your way up. So with that out of the way, though, assuming that language isn't a barrier, then what actually makes things difficult to read? Well, it's some combination, I think, my own reading, of structure, density, specificity, and unfamiliarity. I think that these are the things that generally create difficult reading. So when I say unfamiliarity, I mean unfamiliarity with the terms, unfamiliarity with maybe like some of the presumed background knowledge or equations, right? Specificity is pretty self-explanatory. Density of material as well, pretty self-explanatory. You might see this a lot actually, even like history books, for example, are quite dense sometimes. And then obviously like math books are like that as well. And with structure, I'm mainly referring to the fact that some books present axiomatic arguments. So that occurs in both math, proof-based math at least, which is the majority of math textbooks, and in philosophy. So that's where you see axiomatic argumentation. So I think generally those are the things that typically make things difficult to read. Now, how do you deal with that? Well, basically you create notes that deal with those things that create difficulty. So, for example, how do I make my notes generally? And also, how do I recommend that you take notes? So, I mean, everyone's kind of seen, well, I wouldn't say everyone, but, you can take a look at some of the notes that I leave on my books and, the stuff that I read. A lot of it's pretty generic, but there's some things to take away from that. So, for example, they include things like references to other materials and things, and this helps deal with the unfamiliarity problem by creating links to things that that are not in that subject. So, for example, you might be able to think of, say you're learning a language, for example, right? You might be reading through a book and you don't really know how the meaning of that sentence in the new language, for example. The context then of that sentence can be used to pick apart the meaning of particular words, at least if you have some knowledge of the language, enough to read most of the sentence. Similarly with other things like, say, you can apply mathematical philosophy to mathematical logic and vice versa, and so on. So and if I guess in a more abstract sense, we can generally think of example, or I guess sorry, I shouldn't say more abstract, more generally we can think of examples of applications of those subjects in our own lives. So for example, say you're studying investment analysis, you might think about how can I improve my portfolio using this information. Okay, so I think that generally helps deal with unfamiliarity. Now, specificity can generally be dealt with reminders of the definitions of terms over time. And one thing I'm going to say, for example, is you'll probably have to do this quite a lot if you're going through a math book, because so many references are made prior to definitions that are very specific. So then why is that? Well, the definitions that you get presented with, say for a vector subspace, for example, is basically a list of conditions that subspace fills. So then every time you are calling on the fact that you are referencing a subspace, you need to understand what those principles are, and you probably will have to remind yourself, right? So that's another thing that your notes should contain, or will often contain. Okay, now dealing with the density issues. Well, summaries and rewording of content, that's pretty straightforward. You should try to represent it in your own words, not because that's necessary. So for example, you probably don't necessarily have to like represent rudimentary topics in your own words, but difficult ones that do not use very particular language, you'll want to reword just to make sure that it's more digestible. Okay, and also one other thing I will say is that if you break down a summary first, or you break down a paragraph into a summary first and then you revisit that paragraph, that's often much easier to go through the paragraph thereafter. And then the last one, dealing with structure, right? So axiomatic argument presentation. Break down the arguments, write down your thoughts. Pretty straightforward. So I won't really give an example of that, I guess, but you can see some of those examples, some of the other videos that I do on reading, right? But you can imagine that if you have an argument with premises, right, you'll want to make sure that you understand logically the connection between each of those premises and the conclusion. And so it can be worthwhile to break down the structure of that argument to make sure that you understand it fully. So perhaps even more generally, say for whatever reason, you forget all this stuff, right? What's kind of the main takeaway here? Well, the main takeaway is that, the main way to improve your reading is to spend a lot of time thinking about the issues that you're reading about. And if you're not spending a lot of time thinking about the issues that you're reading about, you're probably not going to be reading very well. So that's my main recommendation. It takes time to read. Don't worry about that. There's nothing embarrassing about that, and all the speed readers online are frauds. So do something more like this, okay? Anyways, if you found this helpful, please like and subscribe. Take care. Bye.